Elizabeth Harrison felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders as she stepped out of the courtroom. The trial had been brutal, another exhausting battle in a career filled with high-stakes cases. As one of New York's top criminal attorneys, she was accustomed to handling immense pressure. But today was different. Today, she felt worn thin, as if the years of relentless work were finally catching up with her. The usual sharpness in her mind was dulled by exhaustion, her thoughts drifting toward something she hadn't considered in years: a break. Maybe a vacation, some time away from the constant noise of the courtroom. She moved briskly down the busy streets, the hum of the city fading into the background as she focused on nothing but the desire to get home, to leave the chaos behind for just one night. It was then, while cutting through a narrow alley to save time, that something snapped her out of her daze. "Mom." The word hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze in her tracks, the familiar word echoing unnaturally in the dark. Slowly, she turned to face the source of the voice. A woman emerged from the shadows, her clothes dirty, her hair tangled, her eyes wild with desperation. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but there was something about the way she looked at Elizabeth that felt unsettling. The alley was quiet, but that one word, "Mom," repeated over and over in Elizabeth's mind. "Mom, it's me," the woman said again, her voice trembling but insistent. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Her instinct was to dismiss this stranger, to move on and forget this encounter. But something about the way the woman spoke, the way she called her mom, made her blood run cold. "You must have the wrong person," Elizabeth finally replied, trying to sound composed, though her pulse raced with an odd mixture of fear and confusion. No, I know it's you. I'm Sarah." Elizabeth's world tilted on its axis. The name hit her like a lightning bolt. Sarah, her daughter's name. The daughter who had disappeared 20 years ago. The daughter she had long mourned as dead. For a moment, she was speechless, her mind refusing to process what this woman was saying. It couldn't be true. Sarah was gone. Elizabeth had accepted that, forced herself to accept it after years of searching led to nothing but dead ends and heartbreak. But now, here was this woman, standing before her, claiming to be the child she had lost. Elizabeth took a shaky step back, her professional composure crumbling as she struggled to make sense of the impossible. This is impossible," Elizabeth murmured, more to herself than to the woman. The stranger, this woman calling herself Sarah, took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. She looked tired, haunted, like someone who had been running from something for a long time. There was a raw, desperate sincerity in her expression that Elizabeth couldn't ignore. I escaped," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "They took me, Mom. They took me, and they did terrible things to me. But I got away. I found you." Elizabeth's mind swirled, flashes of memories from 2 decades ago rushing back to her. The day Sarah disappeared, the endless nights filled with worry, the hopelessness that followed years of searching. She had forced herself to bury those memories, to move on and focus on her career because thinking about Sarah only brought unbearable pain. Now, all that pain was back, crashing into her like a tidal wave. But along with it came a flood of questions. If this really was Sarah, where had she been all this time? Who had taken her? Why now, after all these years, was she standing here in this alley, looking like she had crawled out of hell? Elizabeth's breath quickened as the weight of the moment bore down on her. Her sharp, legal mind, always trained to solve complex cases, struggled to make sense of this. The logical part of her wanted to reject the idea entirely, but her heart, the part of her that had never truly stopped grieving for her daughter, desperately wanted to believe. "Who did this to you?" Elizabeth finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat tight with emotion. Before Sarah could answer, a sound from deeper in the alley made both of them turn. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. Elizabeth's instincts kicked in. Someone was coming, and whoever it was didn't want this reunion to happen. The air thickened with tension, and Elizabeth's heart raced. She grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her into the light. The questions she had could wait. Right now, they needed to get out of there. Elizabeth's grip tightened around Sarah's arm as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Whoever was coming didn't seem to be in any hurry to hide their approach. Every footstep echoed ominously off the walls of the narrow alley, heightening the tension that was already suffocating them both. "Come on, we need to get out of here," Elizabeth whispered, pulling Sarah further into the street, her mind racing for an escape route. She didn't know who was coming or what danger Sarah had brought with her, but she knew they couldn't wait around to find out. Sarah stumbled slightly, her body weak from exhaustion and the weight of whatever trauma she had endured. Elizabeth glanced at her daughter, her heart torn between the lawyer's instinct to question everything and the mother's overwhelming desire to protect her child at any cost. The footsteps quickened behind them. Panic surged through Elizabeth's chest. She scanned the street, spotting a taxi idling at the corner. Without thinking, she yanked Sarah toward it, practically dragging her to the vehicle. As they reached the car, Elizabeth wrenched open the door and pushed Sarah inside before scrambling in behind her. "Drive," Elizabeth ordered the driver, her voice sharp with urgency. "Now." The driver, startled by her tone, hesitated only for a second before pulling away from the curb, just as a shadowy figure emerged from the alley behind them. Elizabeth caught a glimpse of the man in the rearview mirror. Tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden under a hood. The sight of him sent a chill down her spine. The taxi sped down the street, leaving the figure behind. But Elizabeth's heart didn't stop racing. She glanced over at Sarah, who was huddled against the door, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of questions, emotions, and fear. She had spent the last 20 years trying to move on from the worst day of her life, the day her daughter had disappeared without a trace. And now, here Sarah was, alive, terrified, and somehow involved in something dangerous. The car's steady movement finally allowed Elizabeth to catch her breath. She turned to Sarah, her voice low but firm. "Sarah, I need you to tell me what's going on," Elizabeth said, struggling to keep the panic out of her voice. "Who was that man? And where have you been all these years?" Sarah didn't respond right away. She was staring out the window, her eyes unfocused, as if lost in a world of her own. Elizabeth could see the tremble in her hands, the way her body shook with the effort of holding it all together. "Sarah," Elizabeth said again, more gently this time, "please." Sarah finally tore her gaze away from the window, her eyes locking with Elizabeth's. There was so much pain in her expression, so much exhaustion, that it made Elizabeth's heart ache. "They took me," Sarah whispered, her voice fragile, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "A long time ago. I don't know who they were, but they kept me somewhere, for years. I couldn't escape. I tried, but," her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes, "but they always found me." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Whoever they were, they had taken her daughter and kept her prisoner for decades. She felt an overwhelming mix of rage and helplessness, emotions she hadn't experienced since Sarah had first gone missing. "Why didn't you call? Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Elizabeth asked, her voice breaking. It wasn't an accusation, but a desperate plea. Sarah shook her head, wiping her tears with trembling hands. "I couldn't. They were always watching. I didn't even know where I was most of the time. And when I did, it was too late." Elizabeth reached out, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. She could feel how fragile her daughter was, how close she was to falling apart. "But how did you get out?" Elizabeth pressed, needing to understand how this nightmare had finally come to an end, or if it had ended at all. "I escaped a few weeks ago," Sarah answered, her voice barely holding steady. "I don't know how. I just found an opportunity and ran. But they're still looking for me. They're not going to stop." She looked at Elizabeth, her eyes wide with terror. "That man, the one in the alley, he was one of them. They know I came to you." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. If what Sarah was saying was true, then whoever had taken her was still out there, still after her. The relief Elizabeth had felt when she first saw Sarah was quickly being replaced by a new kind of fear, the fear of losing her all over again. She glanced at the driver, who was watching them curiously in the rearview mirror. Elizabeth needed to think, needed time to process everything. But there was no time. They couldn't go home. Not if these people were after Sarah. She leaned forward, giving the driver a new address. "Take us to the nearest hotel?" The driver nodded, changing course without a word. Elizabeth turned back to Sarah, her mind already working through the next steps. She needed to protect her daughter, figure out who was behind this, and stop them before they could take Sarah away from her again. But more than anything, Elizabeth needed answers. Answers that only Sarah could give. "Tell me everything," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "From the beginning." The taxi pulled up in front of a small, inconspicuous hotel. Elizabeth stepped out first, scanning the street for any sign of the man who had followed them. The shadows seemed to dance with danger, but there was no one in sight. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. She hurried Sarah inside, her heart pounding in her chest as the automatic doors closed behind them. They approached the front desk, Elizabeth forcing a calm exterior despite the chaos in her mind. She booked a room under a fake name, a trick she'd learned from years of protecting high-profile clients, and guided Sarah to the elevator. As the doors closed and they began their ascent, Elizabeth could feel the tension rising between them. The quiet hum of the elevator was drowned out by the flood of thoughts running through her mind. Sarah was here, alive, but the threat was far from over. When they reached the room, Elizabeth locked the door behind them and checked the windows, her body operating on pure instinct. Only when she was sure they were safe for the moment did she turn to Sarah, who had collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her face pale and exhausted. Elizabeth pulled a chair close and sat in front of her daughter, her mind brimming with questions that now demanded answers. "Start from the beginning," Elizabeth said, her voice firm but gentle. "I need to know what happened." Sarah's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her fingers still shaking from the ordeal. She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself to relive the nightmare she had barely escaped. Elizabeth could see the fear etched into her daughter's face, the weight of years of trauma threatening to break her. "It started the day I disappeared," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was walking home from school. It was just like any other day. But then, a van pulled up beside me. I didn't think anything of it at first, until someone grabbed me. There was no time to scream. They covered my mouth and pulled me inside." Elizabeth's stomach twisted at the thought, the familiar sense of helplessness returning. She had imagined countless scenarios over the years, but hearing it directly from Sarah made it all the more real and horrifying. "They drugged me," Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "When I woke up, I was in this small room. No windows, no way out. They kept me there for days, weeks. I lost track of time." Her hands clenched into fists. "I didn't understand why. I was just a kid. I didn't know what they wanted from me." Elizabeth's heart ached with every word. She wanted to reach out, to hold her daughter, but something told her that Sarah needed to keep going, to finally tell her story. "After a while, they moved me," Sarah said, her eyes glazing over as she stared into the distance. "They kept moving me to different places, like they were hiding me from something or someone. I don't know, but they were always watching, always making sure I didn't try to run." Elizabeth leaned forward, trying to catch every detail, every clue that might help her understand who had done this to her daughter and why. "Who were they?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low. "Did you ever see their faces?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really. They were careful. They always wore masks or hoods when they came near me. But I could tell they were organized. It wasn't random. This was planned. They had a system." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't the work of opportunistic kidnappers. This was something much darker, much more calculated. "For years, I tried to escape," Sarah said, her voice breaking as tears filled her eyes. "I tried to find a way out, but every time, they'd catch me and punish me. I thought I'd never see the outside world again." She paused, wiping her eyes. "Then, a few months ago, there was an opportunity. One of the men got careless. I managed to slip away when they were moving me to a new location. I ran as fast as I could, and I've been running ever since." Elizabeth's heart pounded as she processed the enormity of what Sarah was telling her. 20 years of captivity. 20 years of isolation and fear. And now, Sarah had escaped, but the danger hadn't ended. Whoever had taken her was still out there, hunting her. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "They're still watching," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I know they are. That man in the alley, he was one of them. They've been following me ever since I got away. I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't want to lead them straight to you." Elizabeth's mind raced. She had dealt with criminals and conspiracies in her career, but nothing had ever hit this close to home. She was furious, heartbroken, and terrified all at once. But more than anything, she knew she had to protect her daughter. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to get Sarah back. "We're not going to let them take you again," Elizabeth said firmly, her voice filled with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." But even as she said the words, Elizabeth knew this wouldn't be easy. Whoever had held Sarah captive for all these years wasn't going to give up. And the more she thought about it, the more Elizabeth realized this wasn't just a random abduction. There was a reason Sarah had been taken. There was something much deeper at play. "I'm going to make some calls," Elizabeth said, standing up and grabbing her phone. "I need to find out who's behind this. But for now, we need to lay low. They can't know where we are." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Elizabeth stepped away, dialing a number she hadn't called in years, a contact from her days as a defense attorney, someone who specialized in finding answers in the darkest corners of the world. As the phone rang, Elizabeth's mind was already working through the next steps. She didn't know who had taken her daughter, but she was going to find out. And when she did, there would be no mercy. The room felt smaller, suffocating even, as Elizabeth paced by the window, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just collapsed around her. But inside that hotel room, everything had shifted. Her daughter was alive, sitting only feet away, and yet the threat was closer than ever. Elizabeth could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The phone rang again, the third time without an answer. She was beginning to think no one would pick up when a familiar voice finally crackled through the line. "Elizabeth? It's been a long time." The voice belonged to Michael Grayson, a private investigator with whom she had worked on more than one high-profile case. He specialized in uncovering secrets people wanted buried, and if anyone could help her, it was him. "I don't have time for small talk, Mike," Elizabeth said, her tone sharp. "I need your help, and I need it now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the weight of her words sinking in. Grayson wasn't the type to ask unnecessary questions, but he could hear the urgency in Elizabeth's voice. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting to business. Elizabeth glanced over at Sarah, who sat curled up on the bed, staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. She lowered her voice, trying to keep the panic from seeping in. "It's my daughter, Sarah. She's alive." Another pause. This time, longer. "Elizabeth, that's impossible. I remember when." "I don't care what you remember," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising despite herself. "She's here, Mike. Right here in front of me. And someone is still after her. She's been running for weeks, and I need to know who's behind it." Grayson exhaled, the weight of what she was saying hitting him. "Okay, I'll look into it. I'll need as much information as you can give me." Elizabeth glanced at Sarah again. "I'll get you everything I can, but I need this done quietly. No one can know I'm involved. These people, they're dangerous, and they're not going to stop until they get her back." Grayson didn't ask for more details. He knew better. "I'll be in touch," he said before hanging up. Elizabeth set the phone down, her mind still racing. She needed to stay calm, needed to think clearly if she was going to protect Sarah. But the enormity of the situation was pressing down on her like a weight she could barely carry. "Who was that?" Sarah asked softly from the bed, her voice pulling Elizabeth back into the moment. "An old friend," Elizabeth replied, forcing a small smile. "He's going to help us." Sarah nodded, but there was a distance in her eyes, a look that told Elizabeth her daughter wasn't entirely convinced. And why should she be? After everything Sarah had been through, after years of captivity and fear, trust was something fragile, something she wasn't ready to give easily. I don't know if anyone can help, Mom, Sarah said after a long silence. Her voice was quiet, but there was a heaviness to her words, as if she'd resigned herself to a truth she couldn't escape. These people, they have power. They're not just criminals. They're connected. They know things about everyone, about me, about you. That's why I didn't come to you sooner. I didn't want to put you in danger. Elizabeth moved closer, sitting beside Sarah on the edge of the bed. She reached out, gently taking her daughter's hand, feeling the tremble in her fingers. I'm your mother. You don't have to protect me. We'll get through this together. But you have to trust me. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted back toward the window, her expression distant, lost in memories Elizabeth could only imagine. The silence stretched between them until finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely audible. They never told me who they were, Sarah said, her eyes still fixed on the darkening sky outside. But I learned things over the years. I listened when they thought I wasn't paying attention. There were names, places. I never understood all of it, but I know they weren't just some random group. They had a purpose, a plan. Elizabeth's mind whirred. What kind of plan? I don't know, Sarah said, shaking her head, but they were always talking about connections. People in high places, politicians, businessmen, people you wouldn't expect. And then there were the experiments. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Experiments? Sarah nodded, her face tightening with the memory. I wasn't the only one. There were others, too. Other kids. But they didn't last as long as I did. They took some of us away, did things to them. I never knew what happened to them. Elizabeth felt sick. The more Sarah spoke, the darker the picture became. This wasn't just an abduction. It was something far more insidious. Suddenly, a knock at the door shattered the quiet tension. Both Elizabeth and Sarah froze. Elizabeth shot up from the bed, her pulse racing. She approached the door cautiously, her hand hovering over the knob. Whoever it was, they hadn't announced themselves, and Elizabeth's gut told her that whoever stood on the other side wasn't here to help. Who is it? She called, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. There was no answer. Another knock, harder this time. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her ears. She gestured to Sarah, signaling for her to hide in the bathroom. Sarah scrambled off the bed, quickly disappearing into the other room as Elizabeth took a deep breath and slowly unlocked the door. She cracked it open, just enough to peer outside. A man stood in the hallway, his face obscured by the dim lighting. He wore a suit, clean and professional, but there was something off about him. His expression was too calm, too composed for someone standing at the door of a stranger's hotel room. Ms. Harrison, the man said smoothly, his voice cold and practiced. I'm afraid I need a word with you. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. How did he know her name? I'm sorry, she replied, keeping her voice neutral, but you must have the wrong room. The man smiled, a thin, menacing smile that didn't reach his eyes. I don't think so. I believe you have something, or someone, that belongs to us. Elizabeth's grip on the door tightened. She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a suffocating blanket. They had found them. Get out, Elizabeth said, her voice low and full of warning. The man's smile didn't waver. Miss Harrison, I suggest you think carefully before making any rash decisions. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't let him in, couldn't let them take Sarah, but she also knew that this man wasn't alone. There would be others. There always were. I'll give you one last chance, the man said, his smile fading. Hand her over, or we'll take her. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart racing as she ran to the bathroom where Sarah was hiding. She grabbed her by the arm, her voice urgent. We have to go. Now. Elizabeth's heart thundered in her chest as she dragged Sarah toward the back door of the hotel room. The man's threat echoed in her ears. Hand her over, or we'll take her. She had heard enough threats in her career to know when someone meant business, and this man wasn't bluffing. The hallway outside the room was eerily silent now, but she knew they didn't have much time. Whoever he wasn't alone, and they would be back. Elizabeth had spent her life navigating dangerous situations in courtrooms, but this was different. This was personal, Life or death. Are they going to find us? Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she hurried to keep up with Elizabeth's urgent pace. Not if I can help it, Elizabeth replied, forcing more confidence into her voice than she actually felt. They had to stay focused, had to keep moving. Fear could paralyze them, and that was exactly what their pursuers wanted. They slipped out of the room, moving quickly down the corridor to the stairwell. Elizabeth knew the hotel layout well enough. She had chosen it for a reason. The emergency exit at the far end of the floor would lead them to a narrow alley that connected to a side street. It wasn't much, but it might buy them enough time to disappear before the man and his team could track them down. Stay close, Elizabeth whispered, as they descended the stairs as quietly as possible. She could hear footsteps above them now, faint but steady, like a predator tracking its prey. They reached the ground floor and slipped through the exit into the cold night air. The alley was dark, just as Elizabeth had hoped, but the city beyond was alive with noise and movement. If they could blend into the crowd, they might just stand a chance. Elizabeth pulled Sarah closer, leading her toward the bustling street ahead. Her mind was spinning, trying to calculate their next move. She needed a plan, something to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. The people after Sarah weren't just any criminals. They had connections, resources. They wouldn't stop until they had her back in their grasp. The crowd on the street was thick, and Elizabeth steered them into the heart of it. She needed to create distance, make it harder for the men to follow. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of a tail, but so far, there was no one. Still, she couldn't afford to be complacent. Where are we going? Sarah asked, her voice a whisper of panic. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. Her mind raced through options, but she knew that staying in the city wasn't safe. They needed to get somewhere secure, somewhere the men wouldn't find them. Suddenly, an idea struck her. She grabbed her phone, quickly dialing Grayson's number. It rang once, twice, before his familiar voice came on the line. I was expecting your call, Grayson said, his tone grim. Things are worse than I thought, aren't they? They're here, Elizabeth said breathlessly, pulling Sarah into a shadowed doorway as she scanned the street. They found us at the hotel. We need to get out of the city now. Grayson didn't hesitate. There's a safe house just outside the city limits. Off the grid. I'll send you the address. It should buy you some time. Elizabeth exhaled, feeling a flicker of relief. Thank you, Mike. Don't thank me yet, he replied. I'll keep digging. But be careful, Elizabeth. These people, they're not like anyone we've dealt with before. I know, Elizabeth said quietly, before hanging up. She turned to Sarah, her resolve hardening. We're leaving the city. It's not safe here. Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. Elizabeth hailed a taxi, and they slipped inside, giving the driver the address Grayson had sent. As the car pulled away from the curb, Elizabeth glanced out the window, her body tense, ready for any sign that they were being followed. The city lights blurred past them as they left the bustling streets behind. Elizabeth could feel Sarah trembling beside her, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing more to be said right now. All that mattered was getting to the safe house. As the taxi drove deeper into the suburbs, the buildings grew sparse, and the streets became quieter. Elizabeth's mind refused to rest. Every corner they turned, every car that passed felt like a potential threat. She knew they were only a step ahead of their pursuers, and that step could vanish at any moment. An hour passed in silence before the taxi finally pulled off the main road onto a gravel path surrounded by trees. The safe house was isolated, hidden away from the world. Elizabeth's pulse slowed just a little as they approached, but she knew the real danger was far from over. They paid the driver and stepped out into the cold night, the trees around them casting long shadows in the moonlight. The house itself was small, nondescript, and perfect for what they needed, a place to disappear. Elizabeth led Sarah inside, locking the door behind them. The house was sparsely furnished, but it was secure, and right now, that was all that mattered. Elizabeth's muscles ached with tension, but she couldn't let herself rest. Not yet. We're safe for now, Elizabeth said, guiding Sarah to a chair. But we can't stay here forever. Sarah sank into the chair, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Do you think they'll find us? Elizabeth knelt beside her, taking her hands. I don't know, but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure they don't. I need you to stay strong. We're going to figure this out. Sarah nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. Elizabeth knew there was no comforting her, not fully, not until this was over. As Sarah rested, Elizabeth moved to the window, staring out into the dark woods that surrounded the house. The quiet was unnerving, and the isolation, while necessary, made her uneasy. There was no one to turn to out here, no one to call for help if things went wrong. They were alone. But Elizabeth wasn't going to let fear paralyze her. She had spent her life fighting for justice, for the truth, and now, more than ever, she needed to dig deeper. She pulled out her phone and dialed Grayson again. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. "Mike," she said when he picked up, "you said these people aren't like anyone we've dealt with before. What do you mean?" Grayson sighed on the other end of the line. "I've been digging into Sarah's disappearance, trying to connect the dots. There's a name that keeps coming up, a man named Richard Vance. He's powerful, Elizabeth. Very powerful. He's tied to all kinds of illegal operations, and I think he's the one behind Sarah's abduction." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Why would he take my daughter?" "I don't know yet," Grayson admitted, "but I'm going to find out. Just be careful. Vance has eyes everywhere. He's dangerous." Elizabeth ended the call, her mind reeling. Richard Vance, a name she knew all too well. He was a high-profile businessman with connections to the criminal underworld, and someone Elizabeth had crossed paths with before. She had no idea that he had anything to do with Sarah's disappearance, but now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Vance wasn't just after Sarah. He was after Elizabeth, too. As she stood by the window, her heart heavy with the weight of this new revelation, Elizabeth knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. Elizabeth stood by the window, her pulse racing as she processed Grayson's revelation. Richard Vance, a name she had never wanted to hear again. A man whose reach extended far beyond the law and deep into the darkest corners of power. But now, it made sense. Sarah's abduction wasn't random. It was deliberate, orchestrated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Elizabeth's connection to Vance went back years. She had once been part of a case that nearly brought him down, but he had slipped through the cracks of the legal system, untouchable. She had moved on, or at least she thought she had. Now, Vance had resurfaced, and he was coming for the one thing Elizabeth couldn't afford to lose, her daughter. She turned from the window, her jaw clenched. Sarah was asleep on the couch, her face peaceful for the first time in what seemed like years. Elizabeth knew the peace wouldn't last. Vance wasn't the type to back off, and now that she understood who they were up against, she had to act fast. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Grayson. "I found something. Call me ASAP." Elizabeth dialed immediately, stepping out onto the porch to keep her voice low. The night air was cold and still, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. "Grayson, what did you find?" she asked, skipping any pleasantries. Grayson didn't waste time. "It's worse than we thought, Elizabeth. Vance isn't just after Sarah. He's been using young people like her for years, testing them, breaking them. His network is vast, and he's got dirt on powerful people. People who will do anything to keep their secrets hidden. That's why he's untouchable." Elizabeth's stomach churned. "Why Sarah? Why now?" "That's the thing," Grayson said, his voice tense. "Sarah wasn't just any target. Vance knows who she is, and more importantly, who you are. This isn't just about her. He's coming after you, Elizabeth. You're a threat to him, especially now that Sarah's escaped." Elizabeth gripped the phone tighter. She had spent her life bringing criminals to justice, and now the biggest one of all was coming for her. But this time, she wasn't going to let him win. "Where is he?" Elizabeth asked, her voice cold, determined. "I traced some of his operations to an old estate upstate," Grayson replied. "That's where he's been running his operations, where he took the others. I'm sending you the coordinates." Elizabeth's mind raced. She had no backup, no way of knowing how many men Vance had at his disposal, but none of that mattered. She couldn't wait for the law to catch up to Vance. If she didn't act now, Sarah would never be safe. "I'm going after him," Elizabeth said, her voice hard with resolve. Grayson hesitated. Elizabeth, I don't think that's a good idea. You need to— I'm not asking for permission, she interrupted. I need to end this, Grayson. I can't let him take her again. There was a pause, and when Grayson spoke again, his tone had shifted. Just be careful. Vance plays dirty. He always has. Elizabeth hung up and turned back toward the house. She grabbed a bag and quickly filled it with essentials, her mind running through everything she would need. There was no time for hesitation, no room for fear. She had to be the Elizabeth Harrison who never lost, the relentless force who outmaneuvered even the most dangerous criminals. Sarah stirred as Elizabeth moved through the room. Her eyes fluttered open, the sleep fading quickly when she saw her mother's expression. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice thick with worry. Elizabeth knelt beside her, taking her daughter's hand. "I found out who's behind this. His name is Richard Vance, and I'm going to stop him. You're going to stay here, where it's safe." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. "No, you can't go alone. He's too powerful. He'll kill you, Mom." "I'm not giving him that chance," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft but firm. "I've fought men like him before. I know how they operate. But you don't know what he's capable of," Sarah said, sitting up, her panic rising. "He's dangerous, more dangerous than you think. You can't just walk into his world and expect to come out alive." Elizabeth looked into her daughter's eyes, seeing the fear and pain that had haunted her for so long. "I won't let him hurt you again, Sarah. I promise." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "Please don't do this." But Elizabeth had already made up her mind. She kissed Sarah on the forehead and stood up, her heart aching but resolute. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." Without another word, Elizabeth left, slipping into the night. The drive to the estate was long and filled with tension. As she approached the coordinates Grayson had sent her, the road narrowed, and the trees grew thick and ominous. The estate loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness, like a fortress hiding the monsters within. Elizabeth parked the car and took a deep breath. She wasn't just walking into danger. She was walking into the heart of the nightmare that had stolen her daughter for 2 decades. But she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not now. The gate was unlocked, almost as if Vance was expecting her. She stepped through, moving silently through the shadows, her senses on high alert. The estate was sprawling, but there was a strange stillness to it, as if the place was holding its breath. She made her way toward the main building, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the door, it swung open. Richard Vance stood there, waiting for her. Well, Elizabeth Harrison," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I had a feeling you'd come." Elizabeth's blood boiled at the sight of him, but she kept her face neutral, her mind focused. "It's over, Vance. You're not getting her back." Vance chuckled softly, stepping forward. "You think you can stop me? I've been playing this game longer than you've been in the courtroom. You're just another piece on the board." "You made a mistake when you took Sarah," Elizabeth said, her voice low, dangerous. "And I'm here to make sure you never touch her again." Vance's eyes glinted with amusement. "You think you can protect her? You think you can save her? You have no idea what I've built, what I control. This isn't a fight you can win." Elizabeth felt the rage burning inside her, but she kept her composure. "Maybe not, but I can sure as hell make sure you lose." Vance's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You don't know what you're up against, Elizabeth. This isn't just about Sarah. This is about power, real power, and you're standing in my way." Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. "Then I guess you'll have to go through me." The silence between them was thick with tension, but Elizabeth didn't back down. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would finally take control of the nightmare Vance had created. Without warning, Vance lunged at her, but Elizabeth was ready. She sidestepped his attack, using his momentum against him. The fight was brutal, every movement calculated, every strike meant to end this once and for all. But Elizabeth's years in the courtroom had taught her one thing. She never lost. With one final blow, Vance crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. Elizabeth stood over him, her heart racing. "It's over." Vance glared up at her, his expression twisted with anger and pain. "You'll never be free of me." But Elizabeth knew the truth. She had already won. She had saved her daughter. She had taken down the man who had haunted their lives for so long. She turned and walked away, leaving Vance to his fate. The night air was thick as Elizabeth stepped out of the estate, leaving Richard Vance behind her, beaten and broken. Every part of her ached from the fight, but she felt something new stirring inside, a sense of victory, of closure. For 20 years, Vance had taken her daughter, her peace, her sense of safety. But now, it was over. The drive back to the safe house was silent, save for the hum of the engine and Elizabeth's heartbeat still thundering in her ears. She kept replaying the confrontation in her mind, the moment Vance had realized she wasn't just another enemy. She was a mother with nothing left to lose. That was the difference. Vance had underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. When Elizabeth arrived at the house, the night had deepened, and a full moon cast its pale light over the surrounding woods. She stepped out of the car, the weight of what had just happened settling over her. It was done. Vance was defeated. But as she walked to the door, a new emotion crept in, uncertainty. What came next? She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, save for the soft creaking of the wooden floors beneath her feet. Sarah was still asleep on the couch, her body curled up, her breathing steady and calm. Elizabeth stood there for a moment, watching her daughter, taking in the peacefulness that had been stolen from both of them for so long. "Mom." The sound of Sarah's voice startled Elizabeth from her thoughts. Sarah had woken up, her eyes wide, searching her mother's face for answers. Elizabeth walked over and sat beside her, brushing a hand through Sarah's hair. "It's over," Elizabeth whispered, her voice steady. "He won't hurt you anymore." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief. She sat up and wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tightly. For the first time in years, they both allowed themselves to let go, to feel the weight of everything that had happened. "He's really gone?" Sarah asked, her voice small and fragile. Elizabeth nodded, pulling Sarah closer. "Yes, he won't come after you again. I promise." For a long time, they sat there in silence, mother and daughter, both feeling the emotional release of years of fear, trauma, and separation. But now, there was something else, hope. Elizabeth could feel it in the way Sarah's body relaxed against hers, in the way her breathing had steadied. They had survived the nightmare. Now, it was time to heal. The following weeks were a blur of recovery. Sarah stayed with Elizabeth, slowly rebuilding her life, piece by piece. It wasn't easy. The scars of her captivity ran deep, and the trauma wasn't something that could be erased overnight. But she was free now, truly free, and that was all that mattered. Elizabeth, too, felt the shift. For the first time in years, she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next battle. She had faced her greatest enemy and won. But it wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something new, a life where she could finally focus on what mattered most. "Sarah," one afternoon, as they sat in the small garden behind Elizabeth's house, Sarah spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think it'll ever really be over?" she asked, her eyes on the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. "Everything Vance did, all the people he hurt, do you think we'll ever be able to move past it?" Elizabeth considered her daughter's words carefully before answering. "I don't think the pain will ever completely go away," she said honestly, "but it doesn't have to control us anymore. What he did, the years he took from you, they'll always be part of your story, but they don't have to be the end of it." Sarah looked at her mother, the weight of everything they'd been through reflected in her eyes. But there was something else there too, strength, resilience. The fear was still there, but it no longer defined her. "You're right," Sarah said softly, nodding. "It's not the end." Elizabeth smiled, reaching over to squeeze Sarah's hand. "No, it's just the beginning." As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth found herself easing into a new routine, one that no longer revolved around cases and courtrooms. She had taken a leave of absence from her firm, unsure if she would ever return to her old life. The law had been her shield for so long, a way to cope with the loss of Sarah. But now, she didn't need it anymore. She had her daughter back, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, the news flashed across the TV screen. Richard Vance had been arrested. Grayson's investigation had uncovered a trove of evidence linking Vance to human trafficking, illegal experiments, and corruption at the highest levels. The authorities had raided his estate shortly after Elizabeth's confrontation with him, and now he was behind bars. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked, watching the news anchor detail Vance's crimes. Elizabeth nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Yes, it's really over." Sarah smiled, a small, genuine smile, the first Elizabeth had seen in a long time. And in that moment, Elizabeth knew that they were going to be okay. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would walk it together. Epilogue. Moving forward. Months passed, and slowly, life began to settle into a new normal. Sarah started therapy, working through the trauma of her years in captivity. Elizabeth, too, began to heal, letting go of the guilt that had haunted her for so long. They both knew it would be a long journey, but they were no longer walking it alone. One afternoon, Sarah came to Elizabeth with an idea. "I want to help people like me," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "People who've been through what I have. I want to make sure no one else has to suffer the way I did." Elizabeth felt a swell of pride. Her daughter had endured more than most people could ever imagine, but she had come out the other side stronger, determined to use her pain for good. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Elizabeth said, smiling, "and I'll be with you every step of the way." Together, they began laying the groundwork for a foundation dedicated to helping victims of human trafficking and abuse, a way to turn their pain into purpose. In the end, Richard Vance had taken years from them, but he hadn't won. Elizabeth and Sarah had reclaimed their lives, and now they were ready to move forward, not as victims, but as survivors. And as they stood together, looking toward the future, they knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.